How does it feel being in DC, especially during this summit?
Well, it's a great time to be here. You always get to experience the nation when you come to Washington, D.C. This is a week where you get to almost experience the world with so many African leaders here for what I think is such an important summit, both for Africa and for the United States.
Right, and for Microsoft, because today you actually announced this huge, very ambitious commitment to have 100 million Africans connected by the end of 2025. How do you do that? What is the investment that Microsoft is committing to do that?
Well, the fascinating thing about this initiative, which I love, is that it brings together finances from us and seed funding and the like, but more important than that is really the collection of companies that we're bringing together. Because the goal, as you said, is to bring broadband internet connectivity to 100 million Africans in 2 years. So you need a satellite company like Viasat, you have local telecommunications companies, you need electricity companies because in some cases these people don't have electricity, you need the government. It really does take a big village, and a big part of what we do is actually facilitate all of that because we've been doing this around the world for the last 5 years.
And so what are those partnerships that are in place? I mean, you mentioned you've been doing it for the past 5 years. What are some of the situations in which this has been working and you're going to replicate elsewhere?
We have done this since July of 2017. We actually launched it here in Washington, D.C. And we've now brought internet connectivity to 51 million people. So I feel like we now know what we're doing. Africa has some very specific and almost unique challenges, because there's 850 million people in Africa who don't have access to the internet and 600 million who don't have access to electricity. So to succeed in Africa, you really need a connectivity and an energy strategy, and they come together. So we have telecommunications partners, as I mentioned, but a lot of times now we have worked in Central America, we've worked in Asia, we've worked across Africa already. And there are fascinating smaller companies that bring in solar panels. They set up electricity generation that powers the connectivity. And then it enables people, among other things, to come in and charge their phones. So even if you can't bring electricity to the entire community, you start to create a motion that just grows and accelerates the economy as a whole.
How critical are those smaller companies to sort of getting this initiative, seeing the success of this initiative from Microsoft?
I think the smaller companies are indispensable. It's easy for people to look at a name like Microsoft, they recognize the name, but a company that I first met in rural Kenya 11 years ago is Mwingu. It's the Swahili name for cloud. It makes sense. We're bringing the cloud to people in Kenya. They're a great example of the kind of company you increasingly find across Africa. Homegrown, a startup. We've provided some capital for them over the years. But the real key is you just get a market mechanism going. That's how you make this kind of activity economically sustainable.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that because from Microsoft's perspective, it's not just about the investment, right? You want it to sustain. So have you seen any of those returns at this point in time to the investment that you've committed to connectivity?
I think we have, but I would actually put it in two very different contexts. Because sometimes our shareholders ask, why are you doing this? I mean, what's in it for the value of the company we own?
They've said that to you?
Oh, absolutely. People say across the board, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And I think what people miss is that we have so many opportunities in the world, perhaps even more in Africa, to combine doing well for ourselves and our employees and shareholders and doing good for countries or, say, a continent. And so, yes, there's an economic return when we make a direct investment, but what we're also doing is building a market for cloud services, building a market for data, building a market for the kinds of things that we provide. We have large data centers right now in South Africa. They serve the entire continent. We'll need to expand to have data centers in more parts of Africa. And this is how you build a market. It's how you grow an economy. It's really how you create opportunities for 1.3 billion people who, as you know, more than half are below the age of 20. So it all fits together.
How do shareholders respond though when you tell them that?
I think that when they hear the equation, and then we point out that our share price has done pretty darn well the last decade, they say, okay, I get it. I really do feel that as a company, we perhaps more than most companies, perhaps more than most tech companies, have really fashioned a mission that focuses on broader economic growth, protecting people's fundamental rights, environmental sustainability and the like. All of these things do fit together. They need to serve customers or we don't grow. They need to serve customers or we don't deserve to grow.
And where does regulation fit into that? Because I know the countries that you're focusing on, Egypt, Senegal, Angola, I think we have to remember that we're not talking about the continent as a whole, right? There's countries within this. So how does the regulatory environment at this point in time aid in what Microsoft's trying to do?
I think the regulatory environment is hugely important. And I think one of the things that I find so striking is what I almost view as an opportunity for African governments to leapfrog the rest of the world, not just in, say, clean energy, where there isn't yet electricity, not just in broadband, where there's not yet connectivity, but a new approach to regulation. When I come to Washington, D.C., there is a legacy of government agencies. I might have to visit 3 or 6 or 8 different agencies. But when I was, say, in Cairo or Nairobi or Lagos, or when I've been in Accra, what you find is not just a healthy business community, but you find a more singular information communications and technology, ICT ministry. They're led by people who understand the business and the technology. They brought together the different policies that one needs, and they're moving fast. We have been able to bring internet connectivity with a company like Mwingu to people in Kenya because the government moved very quickly to create a pilot license for something called TV white spaces. We have been debating those kinds of things here in Washington with the Federal Communications Commission for the last 5 years. That's where, in some ways, the opportunity to move faster is greater in Africa than in some other places.
Have you spoken with African governments specifically? I know you mentioned Kenya, but outside of that, because there is a lot of focus on some of the bigger markets across Africa. How do you expand that out, though, to more of these governments to see some of the progress that you're shooting for?
It's a really important question, and I would say 2 things. First, we start by remembering that 80% of the population in Africa is in 20 countries. So you start with the 4 or 5 that you then expand to 20. Ultimately, we need to reach every country in Africa, in my view. We need to reach the so-called least developed countries in Africa and elsewhere around the world. One of the other hats I wear is on behalf of the UN Secretary General, one of the advocates for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I will lead the private sector track at the big UN conference in March. And so it really does need to be our mission, in my view, to create an economic engine that can expand and reach the least developed countries in Africa. One of the things that I'm inspired and encouraged by is I'm seeing more government leaders in other parts of the world, including in Europe, saying, hey, we want to partner with you, including to go to the least developed countries. We want to bring our businesses there. People are awakening, not probably as quickly as they should, but ultimately the most valuable resource in the world is people. They may not have as much money. They may not yet have all this training that they will need, but my gosh, they are energetic, they are entrepreneurial, they are smart, and people are waking up to that as a long-term opportunity.
What gets in the way of that?
I think that there's many things, to be honest, that get in the way. I think we don't have a level playing field in the world around education and training, and with LinkedIn that Microsoft owns, we can play a role in that. There's not distribution of jobs, so you've got to get the market moving to create local jobs. We absolutely need great government leadership and support, not just with good regulatory policies, but frankly, everywhere in the world, and certainly including Africa. We need to continue to fight with corruption, because corruption is just this huge weight that holds back countries. And that's where the fact that we've got development banks, the United Nations, others really taking that on, I think those things can give us some hope if we can continue to bring them together.
Still a long way to go.
But we've got a long, the right way to think about Africa, in my view, is it's the continent of the 21st century. And we still have 78 years to go before the end of this century.
Right. And Brad, before I let you go, I have to ask you about the Microsoft Activision deal because everyone is talking about it. It's obviously top of mind for a lot of people. You have the FTC, you have the European Union now sort of going after this, but you said you're still confident in this deal going through. I mean, what gives you that confidence?
Well, at the end of the day, these decisions are made under laws, not just under people. And the laws, whether you're talking about the United States or the United Kingdom or the European Union, are very clear. It's all about whether an acquisition will promote competition. Right. And in our view, we're competing with Sony, Microsoft, Xbox. If you put it head-to-head with Sony PlayStation, they have 70%, we have 30%. We're the small entrant. They have 286 exclusive titles, we have 59. We need some more first-party games in order to be a healthier and stronger competitor. And we need to do it, of course, in a way that doesn't impede competition along the way. All of these concerns have basically focused on one title, a great title, a game, Call of Duty, but we've said we're prepared to commit contractually, we're prepared to commit under a consent decree or an undertaking, that will be available for Sony on comparable terms to Xbox for the next decade. So I look at this and say, this will be good for competition, and we have a solution to the one problem that seems to bother people the most. And my only real complaint or concern, if you will, about where we are in Washington, D.C., is that we had the Federal Trade Commission vote to block this without giving us even a single meeting at which to sit down with the FTC staff and talk about the consent decree proposal and solution we had put on the table. I don't think that is appropriate. I don't think that's right. I don't think we should have governments rejecting potential solutions without at least first having a real conversation about them. That's not a recipe that will advance competition.
So what happens next then?
Well, we have a process in Washington, D.C., and it's called lawyers get to go argue before a judge under the law, an administrative law judge. And this still goes forward in other countries.
Right.
It has a long ways to go. We'll see. Look, nobody ever has a crystal ball in which you can predict the future with 100% certainty. But when I look at what this acquisition will bring, I think it will bring good things to the marketplace. It will definitely be good, in our view, for people who develop games, consumers who play games. That's, after all, the real focus of what competition law is all about.
Anticipating the deal to go through in 2023, or?
Well, we have a period of time. We originally said, when we announced this in January of this year, 2022, that we were looking at it in 2023, and that's still the way we look at it.
Still confident.
Yeah.
Brad Smith, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us in Washington.